Hello everyone, welcome. In this part of the video, I will be covering muscles of the anterior compartment of the forearm. But before we jump into the muscles, let's see organization of the forearm. So forearm is the third segment of the upper limb, and it extends from elbow to wrist. And internally, it consists of radius and ulna, which are interconnected by the interosseous membrane. And like the arm, forearm is surrounded by a deep fascia, which is known as antebrachial fascia. As you know, it forearm, in other words, it's known as antebrachium. So the fascia, it's known as antebrachial fascia. So when we see a transverse section of the forearm, under the skin, we'll see the deep fascia, which is the antebrachial fascia. This antebrachial fascia, it sends intermuscular septum. So as you see it here, this is anterior intermuscular septum. It's an extension from the deep fascia. So this intermuscular septum plus radius plus ulna and plus the interconnecting interosseous membrane, they divide the forearm into two compartments. So anterior compartment and posterior compartment. So the anterior compartment, their main action is flexion. So in other words, known as flexor compartment. The posterior compartment, their main action is extension. So it's known as extensor compartment. But normally the anterior compartment, the flexors, are roughly 2 times stronger than the extensors, the posterior compartment. And as you see it here proximally, the anterior and posterior compartment, they are not truly anterior and posterior. They are just, they lie side by side. But when we see the distal part of the forearm, the anterior compartment lies ventrally and the posterior compartment lies dorsally. But in the proximal segment, they are not anterior and posterior. They are just side by side. So the anterior compartment, their main function is flexion of wrist. But in addition, some of the muscles in the anterior compartment, they pronate the forearm. And most of the muscles in the anterior compartment, they are innervated by median nerve. There are exceptions, except 1.5 muscle. All the remaining muscles in the anterior compartment, they are innervated by median nerve. The posterior compartment, their main action is extension of wrist, and some of the muscles in the posterior compartment, they supinate the forearm. And without any exception, all the muscles in the posterior compartment, they are innervated by radial nerve. And when you see the muscles in the anterior compartment, there are 8 muscles, and most of the muscles in the anterior compartment, they originate from medial epicondyle. So most of the muscles, they originate from medial epicondyle. As you know it in the distal part of humerus, we have 2 small bony bits, small bony projections, which are medial and lateral epicondyle. So most of the muscles in the anterior compartment, the flexor muscles, they originate from medial epicondyle. We'll see it in a minute. The muscles in the anterior compartment, they are arranged in 3 layers, except the deep layer, the superficial and intermediate layer, they originate from medial epicondyle. So their function is flexion and pronation. They are flexors and pronators. And they are arranged in 3 layers. We have 8 muscles, and they are arranged in 3 layers. We have superficial layer, intermediate layer, and deep layer. Superficial layer consists of 4 muscles. The intermediate layer consists of a single muscle, and the deep layer consists of 3 muscles. And most of them, with the exception of 1.5 muscle, most of them are innervated by median nerve. The exceptions, the remaining 1.5 muscles, they are innervated by ulnar nerve. So first, let's see the superficial layer. The superficial layer, it consists of 4 muscles. and they have a common origin from medial epicondyle. So we have most laterally, we have pronator teres muscle. Just next to pronator teres, we have flexor carpi radialis muscle on the side of the radius. Just next to radialis, we have palmaris longus muscle. And most medially, we have flexor carpi ulnaris muscle. So most of the muscles, they are named based on their function and based on their relative location and based on their site of action. So flexor indicates their action. Carpi indicates their site of action. Carpi means wrist. They act on the wrist. And radialis indicates their relative location. Radius is found laterally, so this muscle lies laterally. Ulna is found medially, so this muscle lies medially. So first, let's see pronator teres muscle. It's a short muscle, and it originates from medial epicondyle of humerus and from the coronoid process of ulna, and it's inserted into radius. So it's a short muscle. It only crosses the elbow joint. It doesn't cross the wrist joint. It's a short muscle. So at the named case pronator teres, its action is pronation. But before that, in this 3D, you can see its origin and insertion. So it originates from medial epicondyle and from ulna, coronoid process of ulna, and it's inserted into radius. And at the name indicates its action is pronation. But in addition to pronation, as you see it here, it crosses the elbow joint ventrally. So in addition to pronation, it can flex the elbow joint. But its main action is pronation. As you see it here, when this muscle contracts, it pulls the radius down, so it pronates our forearm. So as you know, during pronation, radius, it crosses over ulna. So when this muscle contracts, it pulls the radius, and radius will cross over ulna and pronates our forearm. But in addition, it can also flex the wrist joint. I mean elbow joint. And it's innervated by median nerve. The other thing, median nerve, it runs through this muscle. When median nerve descends from arm to forearm, it runs through this muscle. So when there is any swelling or when there is tightness of this muscle, it can compress median nerve. Now let's see the second muscle in the superficial layer, which is flexor carpi radialis muscle. It just lies medial to pronator teres muscle, just next to pronator teres muscle, as you see it here. And this muscle, it's used as a landmark to find the radial artery. You can see it here. Here is the tendon of flexor carpi radialis muscle, and lateral to this tendon, we can find radial artery. So this muscle can be used to find the radial artery, so it can serve as a landmark. So it originates from medial epicondyle, and it's inserted into the base of second metacarpal. So its action is flexion of the wrist, but in addition to flexion, it can abduct the wrist, or it can radially deviate the wrist. So when this muscle contracts, as you see it can flex the wrist, but in addition to flexion, it can radially deviate, or it can abduct our hand. And it's also innervated by median nerve. The next muscle is palmaris longus muscle. This muscle has a very short and weak belly, but it has a very long tendon. And the tendon is a very important landmark. It's used to find median nerve. So median nerve lies lateral to the tendon of palmaris longus muscle. And this muscle is absent in 14 up to 15% of the individuals. But they will not lose anything. It's a weak muscle, so they will not lose anything in function. So it originates from medial epicondyle, and it's inserted into palmar aponeurosis. So the tendon, after it crosses the wrist joint, it fans out and it's inserted into the palmar aponeurosis. So its function is it flexes the wrist and it tenses palmar aponeurosis. But as I've told you, it's not that much a strong muscle. It's a very weak muscle. And it's innervated by median nerve. So it has a very long tendon, and the tendon can be used for tendon grafting when there is damage in other important tendons. This tendon can be used for grafting, tendon grafting. The last muscle in the superficial layer is flexor carpi ulnaris muscle. It's the most medial muscle. And flexor carpi ulnaris has two heads in its proximal attachment, or it has two origin sites. It has humeral head that originates from medial epicondyle of humerus, and it has ulnar head, which originates from the posterior aspect of olecranon process of the ulna. So in between, as you see, there is a gap. So ulnar nerve runs through this gap. So proximally, it has two heads, and ulnar nerve runs between the two heads. And it's inserted into the medial carpal bones, which are pisiform and hook of Hammett, and it's also inserted into the fibs metacarpal. It crosses the wrist joint, so when this muscle contracts, it can flex the wrist. But in addition, this muscle lies medially, so when this muscle contracts, it adducts our hand, or it ulnar deviates our hand. So as you see it here, when it contracts, it can flex the wrist, but in addition, it can adduct our hand. If you remember, flexor carpi radialis, it lies laterally. So when it contracts, it abducts the hand. Flexor carpi ulnaris, it lies medially. So when it contracts, it adducts their hand. So adduction is ulnar deviation, and abduction is radial deviation. So flexor carpi ulnaris, it ulnarly deviates our hand. And this is one of the exceptions. It's innervated by ulnar nerve. So ulnar nerve runs between the two heads, and it also supplies or innervates the flexor carpi ulnaris muscle. And when you see the intermediate layer, in the intermediate layer, we have one muscle, which is flexor digitorum superficialis muscle. So digitorum, as the name indicates, this muscle acts on the medial 4 digits, and it's superficialis. So if there is superficialis, there needs to be a profundus. Profundus means deep, because these are relative terms. So if we say superficialis, we need to have a deep one. So as you see, flexor digitorum superficialis, it's a flat muscle, which forms the intermediate layer. And it originates from medial epicondyle, and some of the fibers originate from radius, or you can see it here from medial epicondyle and from the shaft of radius. And distally, this muscle has 4 tendons. It splits into 4 tendons, and the tendons insert into the middle phalanges of the medial 4 digits. So the tendon splits, and it inserts into the side of the middle phalanges of the medial 4 digits. So its action is flexion of wrist, flexion of metacarpophalangeal joint, and flexion of proximal interphalangeal joints. It crosses many joints. It crosses wrist. It crosses metacarpophalangeal. Metacarpophalangeal, as the name indicates, it's between metacarpals and phalanges. And it also crosses the proximal interphalangeal joints. So it acts on all these joints. It flexes metacarpophalangeal, wrist, and proximal interphalangeal joints. And is innervated by median nerve. And when you see the deep layer, there are 3 muscles in the deep layer. We have flexor digitorum profundus muscle. This is flexor digitorum profundus. This is flexor pollicis longus muscle. And distally, we have pronator quadratus muscle. So flexor digitorum profundus muscle, it's a deep muscle. It lies under superficialis, that's why it's known as profundus. Like superficialis, it's digitorum. This muscle also acts on the medial 4 digits. Generally, the deep muscles, they do not originate from the medial epicondyle, from the common origin site. The deep muscles, either they originate from radius or ulna or the interosseous membrane in between. They do not cross the elbow joint. So they do not originate from the medial epicondyle, all the deep muscles. So when we see the origin of flexor digitorum profundus, it originates from ulna, as you see it here, and from the interosseous membrane. And when you see its insertion, like flexor digitorum superficialis, profundus also gives 4 tendons. And profundus inserts into the distal phalanges. Superficialis, it inserts into the middle phalanges, but profundus, it is inserted into the distal phalanges. It runs under superficialis, under the tendon of superficialis, and it's inserted into the distal phalanges of the medial 4 digits. So like superficialis, it flexes wrist, it flexes metacarpophalangeal joint, and it flexes proximal interphalangeal joint. And in addition, it flexes distal interphalangeal joints. It crosses the distal interphalangeal joint, so it can also act on the distal interphalangeal joint. So it's the only muscle that flexes the distal interphalangeal joint. So this muscle helps us make a fist. So as you see it here, it flexes the digits, including the distal interphalangeal joint. So it helps us make a strong fist. And this muscle is innervated by 2 nerves. The lateral half, which means the muscles that act on index and middle finger, they are innervated by median nerve. The medial half, the muscles that acts on ring finger and little finger, it's innervated by ulnar nerve. So this muscle, it's innervated by the 2 nerves, median and ulnar nerve. The other muscle in the deep layer is flexor pollicis longus muscle. In Latin, pollicis or pollex mean thumb. So this muscle acts on the thumb. And it lies lateral to flexor digitorum profundus muscle. So as you see it here, it just lies next to flexor digitorum profundus muscle. And like flexor digitorum profundus, flexor pollicis also doesn't cross the elbow joint. It only crosses the wrist and joints of the thumb. So it originates from radius and from the interosseous membrane, and is inserted into the distal phalanx of the thumb. So when this muscle contracts, it flexes the thumb. The name indicates its action, flexor pollicis longus. So when this muscle contracts, it will flex the thumb. So it will flex metacarpophalangeal joint of the thumb and interphalangeal joints of the thumb. But in addition, it can also flex the wrist. As you see it here, it crosses the wrist joint anteriorly. So when this muscle contracts, it can also flex the wrist. So as you see it here, when it contracts, it flexes the thumb. And it's innervated by median nerve. The last muscle in the anterior compartment is pronator quadratus. It's the deepest muscle. It lies in the distal forearm and it's very deep. So as the name indicates, pronator quadratus. So it's quadrangular in shape and it's the prime mover for pronation. So pronator quadratus. And it originates from the distal part of ulna and it's inserted into the distal part of radius. And it's the only muscle that entirely originates from ulna and inserted into radius. Its action is pronation. It's a strong pronator, so it's a prime mover for pronation. So as you see it here, when this muscle contracts, it pulls the radius and it makes the radius cross over ulna, which is pronation. And it's innervated by median nerve. So that's all about the muscles of the anterior compartment. In the next video, we'll see the muscles in the posterior compartment. Have a great day.